CPC as a kid, went through, got his degree in divinity and ordained in 1980. Now is pastor of the Buckhead Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Just went to the March on Atlanta yesterday. So we've got him right off of some cutting edge information. He's also the author of a book, Black, White, Diminishing, or one, I forget that word.
Disrupting racism one friend at a time.
Racism one friend at a time. So I think what I'll do is, John, you've done this talk a number of times, so why don't you go through a little bit of your talk?
Sounds good. But before I dive in, I just got to say, Community Press is my home church. We moved to Ventura, my dad did, when in 1966, and he worked for Vetco Offshore Industries. I don't know if any of you remember that. But and I started going, I was at Community Press when I gave my life to Jesus at Forest Home in 1970, and Daryl Johnson was with me that night, and he became kind of my mentor. And of course, I was so messed up, I needed more than one mentor. So Toby Nelson was a mentor for a while, and Dick Power, and just I had so many wonderful memories from those years. And some of your families and some of you are part of my story of growing up in Ventura and growing in Christ in Ventura. And so grateful for some of these faces, Rocky and Toby and Gaylord and some others. I've known you my whole adult life, and those are treasured memories. So just wanted to say that. So let's dive in. I'm kind of a quote junkie, so I've been collecting quotes my whole life. One of my favorite quotes in this type of situation is, when everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks very much. Racism has been a part of the history of the United States for 400 years. And it's expressed itself in different ways, but sadly, it's still very much a part of our DNA today. And that's why it's so difficult, because it's woven deeply into the history of the United States. So the challenge to eradicate racism is really a tough one, but there's hope in that regard. And we're going to talk a little bit about the basis for that hope right now. And this is such an important conversation, because racism is on the front burner of our culture right now. The church has an opportunity to lead out there and to let people know what Jesus has to do in the battle against racism. And that's why that march that I was involved in yesterday was so important. There was about 15,000 of us, and it was led by a Christian organization called One Race. And we were, Atlanta, as you guys know, has been, if not the center, it certainly was the center of the civil rights movement, but it continues to be a center in our country of where this work against racism plays itself out. And it was so good yesterday for 15,000 people to march from what's called Centennial Park to the state capitol in the name of Jesus. And I think it was an important witness to make. And I trust God's using that in ways, some of the ways we'll know, some of the ways we'll never know. So here's what I'd like to do. I assume I know some of you. I've known some of you for, like I said, my whole adult life. Some of you I've never met before. I'm going to make the assumption that that everybody in this screen would say, I am not a racist. So that's the beginning assumption of this talk. We would all say, I am not a racist. What I would like to explore in the next 10 minutes, and then afterwards with our conversation, is, what does it mean to move from saying I am not racist to I am anti-racist? I think that's the challenge before us. I think that's what Jesus is calling us to move from I am not racist to I am anti-racist. And if you think about it, that is the typical way Christians talk about what is sinful. We don't just say, I'm not a murderer. We say, I'm against murder. We don't just say, I'm against sex trafficking. We don't just say, I'm not a sex trafficker. We say, I'm against sex trafficking. So that is the typical response to which God calls us when we're dealing with sin. Now, you'll notice I made a little bit of a leap there in calling racism a sin. And I think we could spend an hour going over all the scriptures that lay the foundation for which we can make that claim that racism is a sin. I want to just focus on one very briefly, because I think the text we're going to read here in just a second really is the foundational biblical truth that we stand on when we say we are anti-racist. And the text, which I'm sure you've read it probably hundreds of times in your life, it's Genesis 1, 26 through 27. And let me just refresh your memory and read it for you. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creature, every creeping thing that creeps upon the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So briefly put, racism is a sin because it dehumanizes those whom God has proclaimed fully human. Racism is a sin because it attempts to minimize the perception of God's image in people who don't look like us. Racism is a sin because to dehumanize what God has pronounced fully human puts us at odds with God's work in the world. And that is why racism is a sin. And like I said, we could talk about 100 other scriptures to make the same point, but that seems to me to be the foundation upon which we stand when we move from being I'm not racist to I am anti-racist. So the next question is, well, how do you do that? How do you move from being to saying I'm not involved in racism to I am against racism? How do you make that transition? I think it has to involve, I think it's basically two steps. One, I think it must engage our heart. I think we have to move from apathy to empathy. I think that's essential if we're going to make the movement from I'm not racist to I'm against racism. I think the other thing, the other essential thing we need to work on to make that switch is to move from ignorance to a place of thinking critically about these issues. So I think it involves our heart moving from apathy to empathy. And I think it involves our head moving from ignorance to critically thinking about these things. So what I want to do is tell you a story, my story about how I moved from apathy to empathy. And then I want to give you an example of how we can apply critical thinking to this issue. And then after that, and I got a couple of ideas if you want to work on that, and then it's open for conversation. So my story happens to involve my relationship with Black people, although the principles we're talking about here could apply whether we're talking about Black people, Asians, Hispanics, or you name it. Native Americans. Racism plays out whenever we devalue people who don't look like us. But my story, the story I want to tell, has to do with Black people. By the way, I use the word Black people. So the lady that I wrote this book with is from Jamaica. And early on, we started to talk about racial issues. And I said, well, her name is Tisha. I said, Tisha, should I say African-American when I talk about people of your race? Because that seemed to be most respectful to me. And she said, well, John, I'm not representing everybody. I'm just representing me. But my deal is I'm from Jamaica. So if you call me an African-American, that's not correct. And it's not quite inclusive enough. She said, if you want to use a word that includes everybody, probably Black is the best word. So I just went with Tisha in that regard. So that's why I use that word. So as Andy mentioned, I went to Buena and back in the 70s, and there was about 2,000 students at Buena during that time. And there was one black guy in the whole school, and our paths never crossed. He was a grade or two behind me, and I just never met him. So I grew, in terms of my relationship with the black community, I grew up in isolation. I just had no experience at all. And so I was in a place of apathy because I had no personal experience. And that changed when I went to Pepperdine. So I started Pepperdine in 1972. And in my sophomore year, I met a guy named Bobby Heron. And Bobby was a black guy. He grew up in LA. And he played volleyball for Pepperdine. And I don't know if you know anything about Pepperdine or volleyball, but they typically are one of the best schools in the country. So Bobby played volleyball, but he also surfed, as did I back then. And so we met each other, started hanging out, figured out that we both loved to surf. So he became my surfing partner. And for 2 years, we surfed together. They probably got an app today you can use to find waves. But back in the 70s, if you wanted to find waves, you had to hop in the car and drive around looking for them. So Bobby and I spent hundreds of hours over those 2 years looking for waves and then going surfing. And we got to know each other very well because when you're driving, what do you got to do but talk? And Bobby said, John, this is tough for me going surfing. I said, well, why is that? He said, because pay attention, Hambrick, I'm always the only black guy in the water. Now, maybe that's changed today, but back in the 70s, that was true. We surfed Leo Carrillo, Malibu, County Line. Sometimes we get up to the Point in Ventura or whatever they call it now. Back then it was called the Point. And Bobby was always the only black guy I ever saw in the water. So when I took off on a wave, nobody cared. I was just another white surfer who nobody cared at all. But when Bobby took off on a wave, it's like everybody in the water, their heads pivoted because they wanted to see if this black guy knew how to surf. And he said, John, sometimes I feel like I'm in a freak show. That was just an example of the pain he had to navigate on almost a daily basis, being a black guy growing up in Southern California in the 70s. And as I got to know and care more about him, I began to have a great deal of empathy for him. And at a high level, here's what happened to me. I didn't have empathy for the experience of black people until I had empathy for the experience of a black person. And when Bobby and I became friends, when I started to care about him, God used that and set me on a journey that has taken me a long ways. And I am still on that journey today. I don't get it all right. I still got a lot to learn, but I've been committed as a Christian to fighting against racism for a long time. And that started when I met Bobby Heron. And again, to move from I'm not racist to I'm anti-racism, we have to involve our hearts. We have to move from a place of apathy to a place of empathy. Now I want to talk a little bit about the other half of this journey, which is the journey we have to make with our intellect, with our minds, with our heads. We have to learn how to think critically about these issues. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So I was doing it, when you write a book about racism, all of a sudden you get invited to talk about racism all over the place. And Andy's super glad he asked me. I love community press. I love Ventura. Those of you I know, I've loved you guys for years. And so I've really been looking forward to this. So this is out of all the talks I've done on racism, this is one of the most important to me because of my great affection for community press and Ventura and some of you. So, but anyway, I was asked by a really big church to do a talk on racism for their staff. And just the staff at this church consisted of about 60 or 70 people. So, and it's in Cherokee County. Now, you would know, but Cherokee County is the county immediately above Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is. And I realized I didn't really know a lot about what was happening in Cherokee County when it came to racism. So I did some I started doing some research, which is so easy to do these days because of Google, right? And we have to realize just because it's in Google doesn't mean it's right. But here's the point: the first step in thinking critically about racism is to gather data, to gather information. Because if we don't do that, we have no facts with which to work. So that's when we talk about the head part of moving from not racist to anti-racism, we need to engage our critical faculties, and that means gathering information. So I was headed up to Cherokee County to do this talk. I started doing some research, and I discovered that in 2017, the average Black household made $20,000 less than the average white household in Cherokee County. And I was able to document that. I relied on creditable sources. I was confident in that bit of information. So as you guys know, the next step in thinking critically is, well, how do we explain the data? You have to come up with theories to explain what you've discovered. So I started thinking about, well, why is there this $20,000 gap between the household incomes in a Black family as opposed to household income in a white family? And we don't have time in a short talk like this to go into the critical thinking that I had to do to explain that, but I want to share with you the conclusion. The reason there's that $20,000 gap is because there is an economic system operating in Cherokee County that puts Black people at an economic disadvantage. And again, we don't have time to talk about how I got to that conclusion, but it is a conclusion in which I feel very confident. And another way to frame that is there is ample quantitative evidence of systemic racism operating in Cherokee County, this disparity in household income being one data point in many. So again, the second thing is we need to move from a position, if we're going to make this transition from I'm not a racist to I am anti-racism, we need to engage our head, which means we need to practice thinking critically. So I wanted to suggest 3 next steps for you to consider. Some of you, this may be review. Some of you may be so far down this road of moving from not to anti that you're ahead of me. Maybe one of you guys should be doing this talk. I don't know. But some of you may be just getting started. Some of you may say, I'm not sure I want to make that start. Some of you say, well, I'm open. What are the next steps? Let me offer 3 next steps, and then we'll open it up for conversation. First of all, build a friendship with somebody who doesn't look like you. Build a friendship with somebody who doesn't look like you. Now, I don't spend much time in Ventura anymore, sadly, so I'm not clear on what the racial mix is in Ventura the way I was when I lived there. But I'm confident this is not hard to do. Maybe it's a Black person, maybe it's a Hispanic, maybe it's an Asian, I don't know. But the first step in making this trip from not to anti is to cultivate a friendship with somebody who doesn't look like you. And I'm thinking about my friendship with Bobby. I'm thinking about my friendship with Tisha, who I eventually ended up writing this book with. You don't start, hey, Mr. Black person, I'm John. What do you think about race? You don't start with racism, right? You start talking about football or music or the movies. You find something that you both enjoy. You start there and you slowly build up the level of trust. And then someday, if the trust is there, if the respect is there, if you've invested in this friendship, there'll come a time when you can kind of put your toe in the water and ask a question. But you don't start the friendship with a conversation about racism, but eventually you can get there. But step number 1 is build a friendship with somebody who doesn't look like you. Give it some time, invest in it, build up some trust, build up some respect. And I am confident God will use that friendship to change you the way God used my friendship with Bobby and countless others since then to change me. The second practical, actionable step I'd ask you to consider is what my Black friends call do the work. Do the work. My black friends want me to be their friend, and I want them to be my friend too. That's not the same thing as them being a tutor. That's not the same thing as them being responsible for my racial education. They don't mind talking about that a little bit, but they tell me that a lot of times white people say, I just want to be passive and listen, and you teach me. And they're going, no, that's not the way it works. If you care about this, John, you need to go do the work, and I'll help. I'll walk along beside you, and I can comment on what you're learning. But don't rely on me to be your tutor, your mentor when it comes to race relationships. That's work that you should do. And I've taken that to heart. And so, man, I've been reading and writing and wrestling with this for years and years. So do the work. If you're looking for how do I start? Let me make one suggestion. Read Strength to Love by Martin Luther King Jr. It's a collection of sermons. And if you're going, okay, I feel like it's time for me to start to do the work to figure this all out, that's a great place to start. And if you, it's an amazing book written by an amazing human being. And I suspect you'll know what the next step is after that, after you complete that book. If not, let me know. And I got a long list of books and other things I could recommend if you're interested. And then the last actionable next step is to start to pray against the evil of racism in the United States. Start to pray against the evil of racism in the United States, realizing that ultimately racism is not just a socio-political problem. It's not just a sociological problem. It's not just an economic problem. At its core, racism is a spiritual problem. And the way you always start dealing with spiritual problems is with prayer. It doesn't stop there, but it starts there. One of my favorite quotes is, never pray without acting, and never act without praying. So that's my talk.